printing was invented. However, it started at the time after the birth of Christ. It was called Acta Diurna Populi Romani. It was handwritten information sheets by the Senate of the Romans. It was daily delivered at public places, and it contained updates, news about current events, along with more general information on political and social life in the capital. Next in the timeline are the Corantos. It was evidently printed in Germany, famous in Holland in the 1600s as brief printed news. It also standardized what news should be, published at least weekly, produced by a mechanical printing press, available to all people of walks of life, print news of general interest rather than religion and or business. And it's also stable over time. Next in the timeline is the Oxford Gazette. It was considered the first true newspapers published in governance of Sir Charles II. It was also the first daily English newspapers. Next is Public Occurrences for both public and domestic. It was a 4-page paper, was the work of Benjamin Harris, who had fled from Boston to London. Even though it only survived for one issue, Public Occurrences was important, not only because it was first chronologically ordered, but also spoke against the government. Next are the Boston Newsletters, published by John Cabell. It consisted mainly on politics, reports, and some advertising. It is said to be libel and censor-proof, and it was only mailed at the time. Next is the New England Courant. James Franklin, the brother of Benjamin Franklin, started this newspaper to depart from the restrictive colonial tradition. Using the newspaper to speak out against a situation seen as harmful to the public began an important tradition that would come to characterize the American newspaper. By the time of 1729, Benjamin Franklin had moved on to take over the Pennsylvania Gazette in Philadelphia. Franklin not only made the paper a success, but also anticipated another tradition that would come characterize journalism. He established a small chain of newspapers. By the time of 1733, the New York Village Journal was established. John Peter Zenger began the publication, and mostly it contained articles openly critical to the governor and his policies. Governor Cosby and Zenger clapped in jail of charge of seditious libel. The significance of Zenger's trial was not in the set of important legal precedent, but it was a symbolic victory of press over government and was frequently mentioned by those arguing freedom of the press. After that, the First Amendment to the Constitution was imposed, impeding the free exercise of religion, abridging freedom of speech, infringing on the freedom of the press. Next in the timeline are the Freedom's Journal. It was founded by a reverend and other free black men in New York City. It provided international and national and regional information on current events. Its editorials opposed slavery and other injustices. Next is the Cherokee Phoenix. It was the first newspaper published by the Native Americans. Next is the Penny Press. Founded by Benjamin H. Day, he made advances in written news by introducing a new meaning of sensationalism, which was defined as reliance on human interest stories. Next is the New York Associated Press in 1856, criticized its monopolistic news gathering and price-setting practices. Also, this is where the yellow journalism started. Yellow journalism. The term was coined in the mid-1890s to characterize the sensational journalism that used some of yellow ink in the circulation war between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. It's a type of journalism that represents little or no legitimate, well-researched news and instead uses eye-catching headlines to sell more newspapers. And also, it came from the comic strip, The Yellow Kid. Next in the timeline is the Wall Street Journal. It is an American English-language international daily newspaper with special emphasis on business and economic news. Lastly, on the timeline is the USA Today. It is a national American daily newspaper published by the Gannett Company.
The history of the Philippine newspaper is somewhat more different than the Western newspapers. The first Philippine newsletter was launched by Tomas Pinpin, who is known as the father of Filipino printing, was Successos Felices or Fortunate Events. It covered mostly about important events and happenings in a certain area. Following Pinpin's debut in printing, he again came up with his Hojas Volantes or Flying Sheets. It was titled Aviso al Público or Notices to the Public, which served the Spaniards and had a role comparative to a town crier. The first actual newspaper, Del Superior Gobierno, was launched by Governor Fernandez del Forgueras on August 8, 1811. It was also the first newspaper that included in its layout the name, date, and place of its publication. Next is La Esperanza. Due to the constraints of the church and government at the time, 35 years had lapsed before the Philippine press continued on its development. The paper, edited by Felipe Lacorte and Averisto Calderon, lasted only for 3 years. The next is Diario de Manila. It was a Spanish-language newspaper published in the Philippines, founded on October 11, 1848 and closed down by the official decree on February 19, 1898. after the colonial authorities discovered that its installations were being used to print revolutionary materials. Diario's existence was significant because it monopolized the market a year after its launch and became the government's daily organ in 1852. It was renamed to Bulletin Oficial de Filipinas, which later ceased circulation by royal order in 1860. The paper reappeared with Felipe del Pan as its editor and encountered another official decree that led to its permanent closure on February 19, 1898. After that, El Católico Filipino was published in 1862. It was considered the first Philippine religious newspaper. Next is when the year 1887 marked the beginning of a more opinionated journalism in the Philippines. It officially began on April 1, 1887 with the burst of La Opinion. After that, the Solidaridad was published in Madrid, Spain. It was financed by Dr. Pablo Riazares and edited by Graciano Lopez Haina. The next revolutionary paper we had, Ang Kalayaan. It was the official revolutionary newspaper of the kataas-taasang kagalang-galangang katipunan ng mga anak ng bayan. It illustrates the cruelties committed by the civil guards and the Spanish friars against Filipinos. The next revolutionary paper was La Independencia. It was founded by General Antonio Luna and his brother Joaquin. It was considered the most significant newspaper of the revolution. The next paper is Periodical El Heraldo de Revolucion Filipina. It was the official publication of the revolutionary government founded by General Emilio Aguinaldo. The next revolutionary paper was La Revolucion, focused on explaining that our claims are as great as our strength, and it aimed to defend the rights that the Filipino have won. Next papers were from the American period. Manila Times was the first daily newspaper in English established by Tomas Gowan. It existed for 32 years and was bought by Alejandro Rosa Sr. in 1927, but disbanded it later on. Next is Manila Bulletin. It was considered the oldest existing newspaper since the 1900s and founded by Carson Taylor. It developed a reputation as the mouthpiece of the American community in the Philippines even after our independence was granted in 1946 and as long as it was run by Taylor. Next paper in American period was the Philippines Herald, the pro-American papers. It was published in 1920 and became nationalistic. Even though the Philippines had a rough history of newspapers, still it is one of the mediator who kick-started revolutions and journalism. Now, let's proceed to the present.
Wow! That's a great travel back to time. Now, let's go to the present. First, I have to say one thing. It's eye-catching. A one-word description for today's daily newspaper. In this day and age, newspapers are with colored images, different font sizes and styles, and more attractive graphics and designs. Now, newspapers exist in the online world, known as the Internet. A great progression in the newspaper industry in a short period of time. It shows some indication what future projects will be. But what is really the present time of a newspaper? In the western side of things, America's New York Times, Disney Chronicle, and Los Angeles Times read the most circulated newspaper, each having their own titles. New York Times is the first to have an application on the iPhone, and also the newspaper of record. Disney Chronicle as the largest daily paper owned and operated by the Hearst Corporation, and the Los Angeles Times as the largest metropolitan daily newspaper in the country. Same thing goes for the Philippines. Now that we're done with our present, let's venture to the future.
Future. It is something that we chase on. But what does the future of newspaper behold? The world is becoming digital as ever. Technology is taking over the lives of the public, making things easier and better. The printing industry suffers as digital demand increases. But as the saying goes, if you can't beat them, join them. The newspaper industry might be struggling print-wise, but digitally, it reigns. Most people are in the internet world nowadays. It is where people rely on getting their information the most. Having that said, it is a wise decision if the newspaper articles were to be published online. Lots of companies are doing the strategy worldwide, such as New York Times, Huffington Post, The Washington Post, etc. And locally like Philippine Daily Inquirer, The Philippine Star, and many more. Apps are also made, and the increase of these applications and websites would increase in the future. To generalize, the future of newspapers may become a hybrid, part print and part internet. The paper in newspaper is not dying. It is simply renovated by pixels, not replaced, but leveled up. The news will remain constant, for it is the most important component of all. Newspapers are not dead, nor it will be. The industry will not focus on only digital newspapers, and it will still keep its traditional printing, only better. Here are some examples of the future. Newsbeat, application for converting an article into audio. Vivids, converting an article into video. The general apps, Flipboard, Pulse, Zip, and many more. Generally, the Philippines have caught up just right now with newspaper apps like the Philippine Star and the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Paper Later lets you save the necessities from around the web and enjoy it in a newspaper. Newspaper as Daily Marvels. Mosquito repellent newspaper. It was published in Sri Lanka. Its ink contains bug repelling ingredient.